Asked to comment on community changes in the past 58 years, and I'm planning on touching on population and including town expansion, professionals in town, affordable housing, the college, local schools, the Old Town Hot Springs, the ski hill, nonprofits in town, and this museum in which we are today.
Can you do that in 1 hour?
What?
Can you do that in 1 hour?
I hope so. As we grow older, parts of our memories start to fade. Can everybody hear me back there?
Yeah.
As we grow older, parts of our memories start to fade, and I know that there are some in here who have been here longer than I have. And if corrections need to be made, please do so. In 1966, the front part of this building was on 5th and Oak, which is now the corner, part of the parking lot for the courthouse. This building was on 3rd and Pine. At 2 different times, those buildings were transported here and fused together as you see them today. Now, each of us has our own story as to how we came to be here. And perhaps in order to set the stage, I should give you some of my own personal background that led to my coming here. My Colorado roots go back to 1871, when my great-grandparents came to Denver from Helena, Montana. And 10 years later, my grandmother was born, and a few days after that, her mother passed away. And my great-grandfather knew of a family in New York, and he went back and he wooed and won the lady that my grandmother always knew as her mother. In 1904, while Horace Greeley was telling everybody to move west, we went east.
Of course.
And Jane, my wife, has a theory that it was my grandmother who wanted to go back to her family in New York, and hence the move. But the upshot of all of this was that as I was growing up, my grandmother was telling me how great Denver was. I don't know if it was normal teenage rebellion or influence of Western movies, but I decided that I would like to be a rancher. And I did work one summer on a Black Angus farm in the eastern shore of Maryland, which only reinforced my desire. I applied to ag schools up and down the mountains from New Mexico to Montana, and I think as a concession to my parents, chose Colorado A&M, which is now CSU, because my grandmother still had friends and distant relatives in Denver. But it didn't take me long to realize that I didn't have the money, or that I would have had to have more money than I had, or marry into it to be a rancher. So I majored in animal nutrition. And Colorado A&M was a land-grant school, so all men had to be in the ROTC for the first 2 years.
Ouch.
I wanted to fly, and so I went into the Air Force ROTC, but at the end of 2 years they told me that my eyes weren't good enough, so I transferred to the Army, where I was supposed to have been commissioned in artillery. But I found out that there was a quartermaster facility in Chicago called the Quartermaster Food and Container Institute, the QMF&CI, which had an animal nutrition branch. And so I applied for and was allowed to, I was commissioned in the Quartermaster Corps. It was 1957 and Correo was winding down, so they said that they only put me on active duty for 6 months instead of 2 years. And when I asked to be transferred to the QMF and CI, I was told I would have to extend for 2 years. So I did that. I applied to go to the QMF and CI. I was sent there. This was a facility with 15 officers, 50 enlisted men, and 250 civilians with 29 laboratories, each of which dealt with some portion of either food or containers for the military. I was the low man on the totem pole as a brand new second lieutenant, and the property officer, who was a captain, wanted out of the property office into one of those labs. So I became the property officer. And when the next second lieutenant came, if I wanted out of the property office, I had to find some place that would have a spot for me. And naturally, the animal nutrition branch didn't have any. But the only place that was open was in the chemistry and microbiology branch. And so, having had one short bacteriology class, I became a microbiologist. This was a time when the Russians had just sent up Sputnik, and the military was interested in developing a closed cycle feeding system for space flights of 6 months and longer. And this was now 65 years ago, and we're just now getting to that point of having that kind of space flight. But we started growing algae with the idea that we could eat the algae, and by photosynthesizing, they could convert the CO2 from the astronauts back into oxygen. When my tour of duty was up, I got job offers from the Electric Boat Company in Connecticut and Boeing in Seattle. Electric Boat Company wanted a submarine that they wouldn't have to surface for a year, and Boeing was interested in the space aspects. Well, I got there, and it didn't take long for both they and me, they and I, to realize that I got the job because of my experience, but I didn't have the background, the educational background for the particular job. And so they allowed me to come into work early, leave in the middle of the day, go to school, come back, leave late. And so I started on a doctoral program in human physiology at the University of Washington Medical School. Anyway, at this time we had one child. Jane was expecting a second, working full-time, going to school half-time, and trying to maintain a reasonable marriage was really stressful. And at this point, my father-in-law asked if I would like to come into business with him and his son in Denver, which I did, and I was there for 6 years. But again, trying to keep business and personal and family relationships separate was tough. In the meantime, I had been recruited to teach a Sunday school class. And Jane said I liked Sunday better than the rest of the week. So I decided that I would like to teach as a career. I could get teaching credentials at the University of Colorado in 2 years, or I could get them at Colorado State College, which is now University of Northern Colorado, in 9 months. So that decision was fairly easy. I asked them how many additional hours, contact hours, I would need in biology or chemistry or physics to be certified in one of those disciplines as a teacher. I was expecting that all my ag classes would be considered as biology classes, but they weren't. and they told me that it would take fewer hours in chemistry than in either of the others. And if they had not made that determination, I never would have been here, because this school district was looking for a physical science teacher, not a biology teacher, at least at the time. Anyway, I didn't want to live in a big city, and we interviewed in Wiggins and in Aspen and here. Wiggins was too rural. Aspen was too phony. And Steamboat seemed like a really nice town. Even though there were only 1,800 people, and many of the streets were unpaved, the town was self-sufficient. It had a hospital, it had a library, it had a reasonable economy, which was a three-legged stool: ranching, mining, and tourism, although the tourism was essentially summer. There were 2 motels in town which stayed open after Labor Day, and one of them only on the weekends. There were 2 stop signs. There were no stop lights. What had been known, the ski hill, which had been known up until a couple of years before as Storm Mountain, had recently been renamed Mount Werner in honor of Buddy Werner, who had been killed in an avalanche in 1964. And that had just come out of bankruptcy for the 2nd time. Jane was a skier, I was not, but I tried to learn, as did our kids. Lift tickets were $2. The first year, season tickets for all 5 of us were a total of $115.
Wow.
Compare that to a single daily lift ticket today. Elementary school kids went over to Howson Hill every day after school, and the current kids soon became quite adept at skiing. The Winter Sports Club was in full swing, but nothing like the powerhouse that it is today. And incidentally, our 4-year-old was in the senior division of the Little Toots. There were 2 doctors, there were 2 lawyers, but the people in the town were friendly and reasonably well educated and traveled. But you did have to be careful about what you said about anybody, because everybody was related to everybody else. Compare that with the large number of doctors and lawyers and real estate people that we have today. Population was essentially Caucasian. There was 1 Negro lady in Strawberry Park, Daisy Leonard, and there were no Latinos, quite different from today. There were 2 grocery stores: the Safeway, which was where the post office is now, and Boys Market, which is where there are offices on 9th Street between Lincoln and the alley. The post office was on Lincoln Avenue between 10th and 11th. Most of the businesses in town were on Lincoln between 3rd and 10th. There were 2 hardware stores, 2 drug stores, 4 gas stations, all between in that area. Where the art department is now was a car dealership. Where the West Side Grill is now was an auto garage. There was a laundry where the Creekside Grill is now. There was nothing between the Rabbit Ears Motel and the newly built Holiday Inn. Steamboat Lumber, it was where there are 4 Victorian houses on 9th Street. There was a J.C. Penney store on the corner of 8th and Lincoln. The high school was at its present location, but it had just been built, and the football field was still over at Howson Hill. And I can recall the first homecoming that we had. The homecoming queen candidates were over there in their light blue dresses with skin to match. There was no Fish Creek Trailer Park, Botanic Park, or Emerald Field, but there were both red and green stamp stores.
Wow.
Small life was different from big or medium-sized city life. When I got my first paycheck, I took it to the Routt County National Bank, which is on the corner here of 8th and Lincoln, where the Wild Horse Gallery is now, and opened up a checking account. Compare that to the number of banks that we have around today. But I opened a checking account. When I got my second paycheck, Jane took it in to the bank, and the teller, whom some of you knew, said, "Mrs. Romberg, I'm really glad you came in. Your account is down to $13.54. And she came home and said, "I don't want to transfer any more money up here. I don't want people knowing all my business."
Good for you.
But I thought it was nice that some folks took an interest in us, even if we were newbies. Long before strings was considered, in 1966 a group was starting a community concert series here in town, which would bring 3 or 4 concerts during the year. And Jane joined them down at the Harbor Hotel, which was at that point one of the social centers of town. The hotel also had a restaurant in it. And while she was there, there was a phone call in one of the public phone booths, and the clerk got up and answered the phone and called out, "There's a call for Dr. Utterback." And this, at which point this grungy-looking older man got up and went to the phone. He got up from lunch and went to the phone booth, and a loud voice said, "Her water broke, huh? Well, I'm eating lunch now. I'll be over after a while." Jane came home and said, "If you think we're going to have another child here, you're..." It took a while to figure out that Doc Utterback was a vet. Even back then, there was a shortage of housing, and the only reasonable place for us to rent was 602 Oak, which is now the Sotheby's office, cattywampus from the courthouse. It was owned by Art Bogue, who was the president of the Land Bank, and the husband of Lucy Bogue, about whom I'll have more to say in just a minute. Art belonged to the Toastmasters Club, which met at the Harbor Hotel at 6 a.m. on Mondays. He urged me to attend with him. I joined and became friendly with many of the town fathers, including Doc Utterback. Several years later, when I had started a mastery level class in the high school, which included using a tape recorder, the Toastmasters met in my classroom to use that facility so speakers could see more of what they looked like or sounded like rather than just hearing somebody tell them about it. I mentioned Lucy Bogue a minute ago. Evidently, for some time, she had wanted to start a college here in town. And when we got here, she had started the Yampa Valley College, which was not accredited and whose classes were meeting in various locations around town. They were having trouble in getting students, and they felt that part of the problem was the name. By the time folks got to Y in the list of names, they had already made their decision. So they changed the name to Colorado Alpine College. She had raised enough money to buy some land and had 3 what were called living learning centers built on that land. But they still had not been accredited. And then she was approached by United States International University, USIU, that promised to come in and bring accreditation to the college. But what they did was they took anything that was of value and took it back to California. They sold off some of the land, and they turned this into a remedial campus. And there was a group of local people who got together and thought that they needed to do something about it, and they raised enough money to buy the school back from USIU and to buy the piece of land back which had been sold off. And out of this, there were two important outcomes. Number one, that group, which was formed, I can't remember, in the mid-70s, I think, has become the Yampa Valley Community Foundation, which now supports nonprofits all over the county and in Moffat County as well. And the school, which then became affiliated with Northwest Community College, in 1982 became the third residential campus for CMC. Now, CMC had started in 1967 with two campuses, one in Leadville and one in Glenwood Springs. In order for this to be a part of CMC, they had to be on contiguous land, so that required approval of the voters in all of the counties between where Leadville and Glenwood are and Steamboat Springs. But CMC has transformed from a two-year school majoring primarily in ski industry kinds of classes to a four-year institution which has a variety of career opportunities. And these are two great success stories. When I started teaching here, there had been a 51% staff turnover. The Board of Education had 5 members, of which 2 spots were said to be the rancher seats. However, Jay Fetcher is the last rancher that I can recall on that board, and he retired about 25 years ago. Starting salary was just under $5,000, but you could buy a house for $15,000. Salaries lagged other parts of the state, and one member of the board was heard to say that there was no reason to raise salaries because this was such a nice place to come that if people left after a year or two, somebody else would come. Even with all of this, the teachers made up the majority of what was the middle class. Compare that with today, where a starting teacher's salary is in the mid-50s, but you can't buy a house for $150,000. And in fact, by government standards, that puts starting teachers in the poverty category. I, along with others, felt that to improve the quality of education, it was necessary to raise salaries to encourage teachers to come and to stay. Art Bogue had told me towards the end of the first year that I was here, he was putting the house that we were renting on the market, and if it sold, I would have to move out in 2 weeks. So we went to look for someplace else to rent. And one of the houses that was for rent was with a Forest Service person who had been transferred. And I went to ask if I could, if we could rent that house, and he said, no, you're going to be gone in a year or two. He said, I want to rent to somebody who will be here for 5 years. I want to rent to somebody in the Forest Service with a 5-year lease. I said to him, what happens if they get transferred? He said, I guess I'll have to break the lease. I said, I'll sign a 5-year lease, and if I leave, I'll break it. But that didn't go. At the same time, there was an A-frame at the base of the ski hill. There was a restaurant, and Ralph Selch was running the restaurant. Jane was working for him. And his parents, who had physically built the house, their house in 1941, were looking to rent it. And so we ended up renting their house for 3 years. We bought it in 1970, and we've been in that house ever since. We, the teachers, started negotiating with the school board regarding salaries, and I became painfully aware of what took place over the years with respect to affordability of living here for the general population. At one point, we had a board president who publicly said, teachers are like mushrooms, you should keep them in the dark and feed them, and I'm being, feed them manure. That isn't what he said. When I hired on, George Sauer was the superintendent, and he had been with the school district for 37 years. As a principal, as a teacher, as a principal, and as a superintendent. Someone told me that if he had been here that long, this job was either going to be great or it was going to be awful. I believe he and Bill Meek, who was in South Route, were two of the last benevolent dictators. And it turned out that this was great. There had been 19 separate school districts in the county, each with its own school board. You can see various of those buildings around the county today. Not all of them are there, but some of them. In 1959, the schools were redistricted, and Steamboat became RE2, West Route became RE1, South Route became RE3. When we came in 1966, the old elementary school building was still on Pine Street, where the lawn is now between, it's between 7th and 8th, 7th and 8th. Although the Steamboat Elementary, which is now Soda Creek School, had been built in 1956. The old building was demolished in 1967, and the school board offered anyone who wanted to come and take what they wanted, which included trees and bricks and desks and anything else. And the majority of the demolition then was done by locals in this manner. At that point in 1966, RE2 had about 600 total students, 235 in the high school. In fact, when I applied in the spring of 1966, they told me, we want you to know how forward thinking we are. This school has been built for 250 students, and we only have 235. But that says something about how stable the population had been here. What is now the administration building had been the junior-senior high school. Over the Christmas break of 1965, the high school at its present location was opened. Since then, the Strawberry Park campus has been built. The junior high moved out of that building into the Strawberry Park campus. The Sleeping Giant opened. Currently, there are about 2,400 students in the district and 900 in the high school. Of course, there was the Whiteman School, which is now Colorado Mountain School, and we have the Montessori School, the Yampa Valley High School, North Route School, and some others which have come and gone. I'm sure that there were folks who tended other folks' small children, but I don't believe that we had any preschools at that time. as we have today. Gloria Gossard's father, affectionately known as Old Man Gossard, had accumulated a large amount of property along Lincoln Avenue, and he had both the hot springs on Lincoln and in Strawberry Park. As I understand it, his plan was to make Steamboat Springs a resort featuring the hot springs downtown. But in somewhere along the line in the late 1920s, he moved back to Chicago. And he gave all of the land that he owned in Steamboat, including the 2 hot spring properties, to the University of Colorado. When the Depression came, CU was not at all interested in a little mountain town on the other side of the hill. But there were a number of businessmen in Steamboat who wanted those specific pieces of property. And they went to CU and they bought back everything that Gossard had given to the university. And after they had finished distributing those pieces of property among themselves, they were left with these 2 hot spring properties. And so they created the Steamboat Springs Health and Recreation Association so that the folks in the community could use those facilities. But they weren't interested in putting in any more money into those facilities. And by 1967, the health department came in and closed the pool down.
Wow.
And in order to get it going again, they went to the FHA for a loan. But one of the conditions of this loan was that they had to sell 500 memberships at $50 apiece to show that there was community support. And I bought one of them, and I caught hell for that extravagance. In 1968, after they had rebuilt the pool, and incidentally, they ran into a problem because I don't know whether they intended to have the big pool in meters and it was dug in yards or vice versa, but they had that problem to overcome. But in 1968, they had a board meeting. They had a meeting of the members to elect board members, some of whom had been of the original group, and they had some new ones, one of which was Martin Crawford. And he was elected for a one-year term, and after that 1 year, he wasn't interested in rerunning. And I was elected into his seat, and I was on that board for 40 years. We had a terrible time. We went through managers, sometimes 2 and 3 a year. And we had one payment to the FHA due in January, $14,000. Doesn't sound like a hell of a lot today, but we had a terrible time every year coming up with that amount of money. And 1 year we could only pay the interest on the loan, and the next year we couldn't pay even the interest. We didn't pay anything. About that time, Link Jones, who was an local architect and also on the board at that point, found Pat Carney, who became our fairy godmother. She waved her wand, and within 18 months, all the back payments were made. We were current, and it's been a success story since then. We sold off the Strawberry Park Hot Springs and used those funds to build offices and locker room facilities and the beginning of the gym facilities. We went to, actually, before that happened, we had gone to the city and we wanted to we were talking about giving the facility to the city. And the first thing the city was going to do was to double the fees. And we said, we got into this bind because we have kept the fees so that anybody in town who wants to use the facility can. So that didn't go any farther. In the late 1960s, they were selling lots out at the mountain for $3,000, which included lift tickets for life and for children up until the age of 21. And it's my understanding that if anyone, and there was one person that I knew of, that still owned that property and they were still honoring that commitment, free lift tickets. In 1967, the Thunderhead lift opened. In 1967, the Yampa Valley Regional Airport opened. As a side, John Love, who was governor at the time, came here for those two openings. And our son, who was, I don't know, 9 at the time, said, Governor Love gets all the attention, nobody says anything about Mrs. Love. And he had at that point one of these little looms that you make, potholders with the loops. And so he made Ann Love 2 potholders. And for the next several years, he, our son, not us, but he was on the governor's Christmas card list. In 1970, LTV bought the ski hill and started to put serious money into it. And that was when property values started to rise. Land development began out in the South Valley, where I had been deer hunting. People began to swell the population. When we arrived, in order to be considered a local, you either had to be born here or lived here 50 years. LTV, shortly after they bought the ski hill, put in the first gondola. One day I was on that gondola with an older couple who were visiting and a young man, 19 or 20, who started pointing out the Hans Peak, Sleeping Giant, some other things, and they said to him, "You must be a local." He said, "Yes." They said, "Have you lived here long?" He said, "Yes." They said, "How long?" He said, 6 months. So things changed. People came here because they liked what we had here, but then they wanted to bring amenities that they had where they had come from and we didn't have here. The town physically expanded. The city limits went out. Kiwanis Club had been meeting at the El Rancho, which is down here on Lincoln Avenue. And when it moved to the Holiday Inn, which had been built shortly before we came, we lost several members because they were not going to drive way down there to have lunch. The county courthouse has expanded, including a justice center. City offices have moved several times and are about to occupy the new facilities over here. In 1966, there were service clubs. The major of those were the Kiwanis and the Lions. In 1974, the Rotary Club started, but I don't believe that there were any nonprofits. Compare that to today, where there are over 100 nonprofits in our town, serving all aspects of our community. I've mentioned a lot of things that have changed. One that in my mind has not changed as much is the number of churches. Granted, the big 3 along Oak Street have either been rebuilt or added on to. And there are more congregations, as the Methodist Church is now home to a Buddhist congregation and a Jewish congregation. There's a Second Baptist congregation. That one thing that has personified Steamboat over the years has been its friendliness. The people may have come and gone, but the friendliness remains. There are those who would like to return to the kinder, gentler days. But I think if they did, many of the amenities that we enjoy today, we would not enjoy. And on balance, I think we're better off now than we used to be, but that's just my opinion. I would be happy to take any questions. There are a lot of things that have changed that I have not mentioned, and you may challenge any of the dates or changes that I have talked about. Yes.
I love going to the library, and they have little stickers that you can put in the book, in your book, and it says, "I came for the
skiing, but stayed for the light."
Yes.
The Buddy Werner Library was, the library had been, the Good News building was on the corner of 5th and Lincoln, and it blew up many years ago. But prior to that time, there had been, the community room was in that building, the police station was in that building, the library was in that building. And then they started the Buddy Werner Library, which is down here. Anybody else? Well, I thank you very much. You've been very patient.